No, no, my pleasure. It's always great to include you. How is life for you?
Ever since COVID, it's been a lot of time at home in my home office, and to be honest, I miss being out on the road and meeting people at your events. I really miss that.
Well, thank you for physically being in Denver earlier in the year. That was good. Really enjoyed that. Today, you're going to be talking about how to securely mine your data warehouse and data lake. And I guess that relates as much to the end users to the channel.
Yeah, I think it really does. And I think it's a new area and kind of a new vector that CISOs, like the folks that you just had on the panel, are obviously concerned about. But I also think it's a big opportunity for managed services providers and MSPs, alike to, begin to provide services at the application layer, which, I think is fairly new because, obviously we spend so much time looking at network logs and, endpoint telemetry, but kind of that blind spot that, really only larger customers could afford to cover is that application space. And, I'd kind of like to just share some thoughts and some strategies and how, data lake and data warehouse could be an opportunity for managed services providers and even large businesses that haven't used that technology before to begin to get accustomed to it and understand how powerful it can be and what it can do for their business and for their customers.
Perfect. Well, the floor is yours. Please feel free to share your screen, and let me just make sure that those security settings are allowed. Yes, we are nice and secure. You're good to go. You have the floor.
All right. Thank you very much. So let me just get the presentation up. Share screen. All right. Are we good to go there, Pelham?
Yes, it's beautiful. It's all live.
Okay, fantastic. All right. So everyone, thanks again for the opportunity. Like I said, I think there is a very big opportunity for all businesses in, data warehouse and data lake. And, when I say that, traditionally only large customers could afford, EMC storage area networks and, big iron to be able to collect data. And, today, a lot of those barriers are being knocked down by the different cloud providers. So what we're seeing here is an explosive growth in, moving data into data lakes and data warehouses. And the ultimate goal of all of this is obviously to be able to take that data and look for the trends and opportunities to create competitive advantage. That's the goal. So with that explosive growth, obviously, the ability to move that into the cloud and to not have to have dedicated, big iron to support it, smaller and smaller customers are able to afford getting into this environment and using these technologies. And not only can they use their data, but a lot of these, clouds now offer access to all sorts of data. So a great example would be, what's happening with the COVID crisis. If you happen to own a grocery store and you wanted to, project how much toilet paper you would need in different regions of, your coverage area, you could correlate the COVID infection rates in different areas in your markets with the weather, with all sorts of other data that you could pull, from public sources to create some very strategic projections and things that, maybe your competitors wouldn't be doing. I think the other reason that this is a great market for MSS providers is there's a lot of vendors right now, and it's very complex and very confusing for smaller customers. They're not going to be able to afford some of the data scientists and folks that, larger companies are going to be able to afford, but it's still a very, very good market to get into and a very good market to learn about and to get you kind of into that application space. I think the other reason that that's really important is that for as much as we spend on all of those network and, endpoint technologies, the biggest threat for most small businesses is either an insider threat or a credentialed, access breach. And obviously, if you see a phishing campaign, great, that somebody's trying to attack a user's credentials. But once that user's credentials have been stolen, when they remotely log into an application, whether it's in the cloud or on-prem, they look just like the user to the network. And so unless you can see, that RTP session or something happening and notice it in that, haystack of needles, it's something that you could miss. The other thing is that when you get into this application space and you get visibility into what's happening between the applications and the data, things like breach response become significantly easier and simpler. And it also helps with your compliance. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit more as we go through the presentation. But again, I think this is a great market to begin to learn about. So what are some of the drivers? Obviously the amount of data that's being stored in the cloud is massive. And the reason for that is that these cloud architectures don't have the physical boundaries that, big hardware had in the past. So, if you have a mobile app that can collect 20 different so that inexpensive storage is what's allowing people to save all of that. But more importantly, you can also use, and we heard about this with the CISO panel, you can use artificial intelligence and machine learning to understand that data at a deeper level than ever before. And you can do it without being a data scientist. Most of the big cloud providers offer these. And, having come from Silence, which used artificial intelligence and machine learning to understand, endpoint threats, I'll just give a quick example. The way that they used artificial intelligence and machine learning was to take threats and send them up into the cloud. They'd use artificial intelligence to break those threats down into their DNA, into their code level. And then they would use machine learning to look for the patterns, right? So what you need to understand about artificial intelligence and machine learning is that there are different maturity levels that you hit as you analyze more and more data. So the more data that you analyze, the more mature your models are going to be, and the more valuable they're going to be, and the more insight they're going to provide. So as you're looking at, how your customers are going to be, leveraging these tools to find competitive advantage, artificial intelligence and machine learning will be very important for that purpose. And the other thing is that there are more and more IoT devices that are storing more and more data, and customers are starting to figure out how they can correlate, multiple IoT devices in an environment to glean, more information from it. So all of these things are, amazing and can provide significant benefits to your customers. But how do they do all this in a very secure and controlled way? So the data lake providers that you're going to run across, as you talk with your customers and other vendors, the big ones are the ones that provide the underlying, cloud storage, Amazon Redshift, Azure, and Google Cloud. But what I'm going to focus on today is a partnership that we forged at RSA with a company called Snowflake. And what's interesting about Snowflake is that they're one of the fastest growing data lake providers ever, and fastest growing companies ever. And part of the reason for that is that Snowflake took the complexity out of the infrastructure and built a very simple platform where customers can not only upload their data in all different forms and formats, and once it gets there, they have a lot of powerful tools that can help them not only model that data and use the data and use things like AI and machine learning, but they've also built the compute layer that can make it significantly faster than an Amazon Redshift or an Azure or Google Cloud. So a query that might take, an hour on Amazon Redshift could be done in 30 seconds on Snowflake, just based on the way that they distribute the compute layer within their cloud. But what I think is really important is that Snowflake is about to go public. They've grown to a $400 million company in just over 5 years. They're a very major player, and if you're not familiar with the market space, you should go and learn a little bit about them. One of the interesting things that they do is they allow you to choose which underlying vendors you want in different regions. So you could have, Azure in the East, you could have Redshift in the West, and you could use Google Cloud in Europe, for example, all through the Snowflake platform without having to have separate contracts and commitments with all those different vendors. So that's why they've grown very quickly. So what are some of the tools that you're going to need to know about to help your customers, kind of garner the strategic advantage that they can get from these cloud environments? The first is some sort of data discovery tool. Smaller customers, in a lot of cases, may not know what data they have, how much of it they have, where it resides in their, on-prem, if they've never used the cloud before, or what's in their data centers, for instance. From there, you're going to need a cloud service to put the data into, and what they'll be using to get the data there is what's called an ETL tool. And this is a tool that kind of batches up the data and in some cases cleans it up, stages it, and then ships it into the cloud service. Once the data is in the cloud service, then you'll use business intelligence tools to do the modeling and all the things that you're going to do on the data. But more importantly, I want to talk about security for a minute, because most customers are going to believe, the cloud service provider is as secure as they can get or more secure than they are. Or they believe that if they use some type of identity and access management tool to gain access to the cloud, that they would be protected from a credential breach in the cloud. And unfortunately, that is not the case. There's a lot of examples where, to the conversation earlier, misconfiguration or misaligned privileges can provide too much access to an administrator or a power user, and potentially get a breach within this data cloud. And the reason that's important is because if they're sharing a lot of proprietary information up into that cloud, you need to have application layer security in your stack to ensure that you can't have that type of breach. I'm going to talk about that in a little more detail here in a minute. So just for those of you who are going to consider, getting into this space, I thought I'd share kind of our broader strategy and some of the partners that we've engaged with within this space, and who some of the bigger providers are for the different tools, right? Tableau has been popular for many years. Looker is a new kind of web-based version of a BI tool. And Domo is obviously one of the fastest growing companies as well. And they have some amazing ways that you can visualize data. And we're actually building a special connector with them that will not only work with Domo, but also with Snowflake. Data discovery, OneTrust is one of the great vendors that's been around for a long time. They can not only help you group the data, but you can classify it, whether it's PII, PHI, PCI type data. There's ETL tools, as I mentioned before, that can help you get the data into the cloud warehouse. But more importantly, we're seeing a lot of different SI partners that focus in this space, which I think is good evidence that for a managed services provider, this would be a great, proficiency to add to your portfolio. So Altr has developed what we call kind of data security as a service. When you look at all of the other products that we compete against, most of them are appliance-based, and most of them were designed at a time when you had a data center and you had, a physical place where you would load that software and run it. You know, in today's distributed cloud environments, we need a new approach. And that's where, you know, Altr has developed an approach where we actually embed ourselves either in the cloud service that's accessing the cloud, or we embed ourselves in the application that's accessing the cloud. And from that perspective, we can do a lot of unique things. Along our 6-year journey, we've issued 26 different patents. So we have some very unique competitive advantages. And we've also become a PCI DSS Level 1 service provider. We have HIPAA Cloud certifications, and our SOC 2 Type 2 is close to being completed. So what does this look like from an architecture perspective? Essentially, what we do is we embed ourselves in the BI tool for the power user that's accessing Snowflake. From that perspective, we asynchronously log everything that that business user does accessing the data in the data lake or the data warehouse. That's some key visibility that we can provide to the SOC. And we do that through the Altr console, and we share that with the SIM or the SOAR tool or whatever tool is, you know, in your architecture that you're using for your workflow. But more importantly, we also share those records with Snowflake so they can be visualized using the BI tools in Snowflake. And we also store them in a secure vault that we've built using distributed ledger technology so that the logs of that access can't be tampered with or destroyed. So now from a you know, governance and compliance perspective, we have an immutable record of that data access. I think the example that I would give that, you know, shows how important that is what happens on the day that a breach is declared, you know, usually at 5:30 on Friday night, so that you have the weekend to, you know, dig through the database logs if there was an internal, you know, access breach or a credentialed access breach, where you know that they've gotten into the application, but you don't know what they've seen or potentially taken. With the Altr platform and those monitor records, you can immediately tie that session back to the network activity and the user's credentials, and within seconds have a detailed report of what was accessed. So that's really important. The second, you know, issue that you have around access to things like a data warehouse is if they've given the wrong credentials, they could potentially take the entire database in one request. What we've done at Altr is we've actually developed governance capabilities within the tool where you can control that access, or at a very minimum, alert the SOC when somebody tries to download more than they should. I'm going to talk a little bit more about zero trust here on the next slide, but what that does is that gives you visibility that you don't have today, either as a you know, customer or as a managed services provider, into access to data in real time. So from a detection and response perspective, you can then begin to build policy that can be implemented by the governance function within the technology and alerted through SecOps, so that it gives them visibility to something that they've never had visibility to before, and it's got very, you know, powerful capabilities. Extending zero trust, which is a very, you know, kind of common term these days, down to the, you know, SQL or, you know, whatever database you're running, you know, layer, really does a couple of things. And we talked about automation earlier in the CISO session, but when you build a capability into your architecture, it has to be automated. And so this particular solution can be implemented in the application without changing the application, without changing the database, with zero latency addition to the application. So now you can kind of get that visibility very quickly. But secondarily, it can't be difficult for users. And this is completely transparent to users. What we've seen in, you know, competing against other competitors is that their technologies tend to slow down responses and, you know, impede the user experience. And what normally happens, according to many of the CISOs that we've spoken with, is that instead of abiding by the policies, what the user will try to do is download a bunch of that data into their own machine and try to hoard it. And so by having this type of system in place, you can kind of limit that from happening. And then finally, monitoring gives you the full facts of everything that's happening in the cloud in any environment where we're implemented. And again, that becomes important when we talk about things like GDPR and CCPA. And the big reason for that is that the types of data that have been protected in the past, things like credit card numbers and social security numbers, have been embedded into providers, kind of like the people that process credit card transactions and things like that. As we expand the definition of what data needs to be protected and how it needs to be protected, those systems were never built to handle the user's image in their profile photo, or their name, their likeness, their IP address. There's lots of different things that need to be governed and controlled that today's technology was never meant to protect. Once Altr is kind of built into that application, all of those things are possible by setting policy within the tool. So it greatly simplifies the ability to do this, and it becomes very portable. Now it doesn't matter if you use Google Cloud today and Amazon tomorrow. There's no vendor lock-in because your security is independent of your cloud service. So something to think about as you kind of move into that space. We can help you work with customers to build some very cool policies and to be able to demonstrate those policies to their different regulation groups. So in summary, data security as a service, I think, is something that we're going to hear a lot more about, and is something that will help you secure these cloud data warehouses for your customers. It has very good time to value. It's 100% cloud native, and it can be delivered as a service. There's no hardware involved. Once the application is set up with the Altr solution, it comes back to our SaaS cloud, and everything can be instrumented from there. It's again very simple. It can be again delivered as a database driver or as an API service, and it provides that global unified security layer that's going to be so important as your customers begin to use more cloud services and have to demonstrate their compliance to their auditors and the different regulation boards. So with that, hopefully I'm within time, Pelham, and I'm happy to answer any questions that the audience may have.
Yes, and no, thanks, Brian. We had well, we got a lot of comments, and I'm trying to distill it. One specific thing I think which we could tease out. Andreas asks, all right, how can an MSS communicate this to a potentially skeptical end customer? Maybe that's more a mechanical question, because you're selling through some other entity. What would you say?
Yeah, so again, this is a new layer of security. As a customer is doing a cloud transformation or moving applications into the cloud, the only telemetry that's available from the cloud providers themselves is network-centric data or the machine data, right? There's no application layer data available when you move something to the cloud. This is one of the first things that can give them a comfort level of what's being accessed in the cloud and how their data is actually being consumed, which doesn't exist today. And so what a lot of customers don't realize when they move to the cloud, once they have their server image from AWS or Google or Azure, the security responsibility is completely on them for their application layer. And so this is a new area that they need to consider and to have strong controls in.
Well, no, thanks. And earlier on, with one of your previous slides, Elio asks, what about overfitting and finding the wrong pattern? Perhaps that's a false positive question. I'm not quite sure where it's going. Is that what you meant, Elio? Well, regarding machine learning, he says.
Yeah. So again, the product itself is not doing machine learning. When I was talking about machine learning earlier, I was talking about how customers can use the tools within the clouds, where they can use artificial intelligence to break down their data to a deeper level, and they can use machine learning to understand it at a deeper level. So it's different than trying to find a security threat. It's more along the lines of I know how often my customers, come to my site. I know how often they hit this page. I know how often that ends up in a cart, but I don't know why my carts aren't, purchasing. So it's more along the lines of understanding business level data than threat level data.
Okay, I like it. Business level versus threat level. Looking through again, Zishan has made a big. Oh, Elio, thanks you for your answer. And Zishan has made a big comment. I think he says that it's a philosophical question, but exponential curve requires exponential treatment without exponential talent. We're left using machine to fight machine. Perhaps we could ask that in a question for would you see your solution being effective in a machine versus machine scenario, or is that a bit further down the line?
No, I think what it is number one, it gives visibility into an area that you really don't have today. And then if you can instrument policy, right? Let's say I know that my customer service representatives work from a call center that comes from a certain IP address, and they should only be accessing data during business hours, during Monday through Friday, right? If somebody tries to access data using their credentials after hours, they should be blocked, right? So we can begin to create policy that can be enforced in real time. The problem with security right now is that policy is normally enforced after the fact, after something has already happened, after a breach has already occurred. We're trying to limit, something from getting worse, right? Here we actually have the opportunity to do something proactive. We can think about, consumption of our data from our application perspective and actually set policy that can be enforced in real time. So this isn't, hocus pocus machine learning type stuff. This is very practical. I don't want, these users consuming more than 10 records an hour because that's beyond the scope of their job. And if they try to download the whole database, I want my SOC to be alerted, and I want it to stop at 499 records. So anything over that would be a declarable breach. So now we can actually see things. I mean, if the credit rating agency that was breached very publicly a couple of years ago had something in place where they could see 3,000 attempts at log on to their server and could have prevented them, it could have prevented the overall breach. So again, getting deeper into the customer's environment at the application layer gives you the opportunity to provide much better security than we can today, just looking at network logs and endpoint logs.
Fantastic. Well, that certainly seems useful for both the end user and the channel. Well, Brian, we do have a couple more things coming in. Is it all right if I leave your email address in the chat box?
Absolutely. I'm more than happy to answer any questions anyone has, and happy to talk with anybody. Really appreciate the opportunity, Film, always.
Fantastic. Well, please, thank you, Brian, for an excellent presentation to start us off. Give Brian a wonderful round of applause. And I'm very pleased I found this applause feature. Ellie Hertz is clapping, and James Bohr had a question, but we'll do that offline. Eric Cron says, well done, Brian. Fantastic.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of the show.
I'll see you very soon. Fantastic. And please keep those questions and things coming. Shalini is clapping. Mike is clapping. Stephen's clapping. Fantastic. Well, moving on, we are delighted to invite to the stage Eric Cron, who is a technical evangelist for KnowBe4. And you may have seen Eric very kindly speak at a number of our MSS series of events. KnowBe4 is a great supporter of our work, both in Europe and in the States. Eric, nice to see you. How are you doing?